Hey, everybody, welcome. So glad that you could join us today. My name is Matt Nightingale. I'm the founder and executive director of Common Sanctuary, and we have been having these Common Sanctuary conversations since September of 2021. And I'm really excited about this afternoon's conversation. I get to welcome Father Shannon Kearns to the program. He is the author of the new book called In the Margins, A Transgender Man's Journey with Scripture. And I'm going to read this short bio. Shannon Kearns is a transgender man who believes in the transformative power of story. As an ordained priest, a playwright, a theologian, and a writer, all of his work revolves around making meaning through story. He is the founder and was the artistic director of Uprising Theater Company in Minneapolis, the co-founder of queertheology.com, and published this book with Eerdmans Books. Shannon is a recipient of the Playwright Center Jerome Fellowship, and he was a Lambda Literary Fellow for 2019 and a Finovation Fellow for 2019-2020. He is a sought-after speaker on transgender issues and religion, as well as a skilled facilitator of a variety of workshops. His work with Brian G. Murphy at queertheology.com has reached more than 1 million people all over the world through videos, articles, and online courses and community. His plays include Body and Blood, In a Stand of Dying Trees, Line of Sight, Twisted Deaths, The Resistance of My Skin, and Who Has Eyes to See. He's currently working on a television pilot, and yet he found time to be with us today. So I'm grateful for that. He also, you'll hear about this later, he went to the same college I did, Grace College in Winona Lake, Indiana, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So without any further ado, let's welcome Shannon to the program. Welcome, Shannon. So glad that you're here with us.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be having this conversation and to be with you today.
Awesome. First, just congratulations. I finished this awesome book last night
Thank you.
and
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I just want to know, what's it like to actually finish a book you've been working on for a long time, get it out into the world, have launch parties, do all that stuff. What has that been like for you, Shannon?
Yeah, it's been really bizarre, right? Because you spend all of this time by yourself telling these stories. And you can part of my process to really tell the truth was to forget that anyone was gonna ever read it,
Mm,
right? To really be like, I'm just gonna go as deep as I can, and no one is gonna see this, and it's gonna be great. And now we're at the point where lots of people are seeing it, and it's both a really beautiful experience. It's also slightly terrifying to be that vulnerable, to tell stories about people, who are still alive and still in my life in some ways,
mm,
or connected to me on, the internet. But it's also been, I think, really, really beautiful to already see people connecting with it, to people tagging me in posts with things that that they really resonated with, or that they experienced in their own life. And I think that that's why I wanted to write this book and tell these stories, because I thought that there would be people that would resonate and that it could be meaningful and helpful. And
mm,
so it's really beautiful to see it starting to reach people and to resonate.
mhm. How long did this book take you, from start to finish, when you got the contract to actually getting it out into the world? How long did it take?
So contract to publish was about a year and a half.
Hmm.
So I had about a year to write it, and then another 3 to 6 months, to edit and to do all of the finalization.
Mhm.
Although I feel like much of this work has been happening for years and years, right? So it's
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it took a year to write it, but really it took like 10 years to go
Yeah.
to seminary, to learn how to do
Right.
this work, to be telling stories. And so it feels like the culmination of a really long process.
Mhm.
But the actual process of writing the book wasn't that long. It was about a year.
Mhm. Yeah. We have a couple people saying hello. Gordon Petty says hello from Warsaw, Indiana, next door to Winona Lake. Hi, Gordon.
Yes,
So yeah, feel
Warsaw,
free
excellent.
to drop in and say hello in the comments if you are watching live. Um, I want to talk a little bit just about pre-book, obviously, some of the
Yeah,
things that have led you to this place. First of all, I have really appreciated your work with queertheology.com. Can you
thank you.
talk a little bit about that. I mean, that's a massive thing. In the bio, I said you've reached over 1 million people with
Yeah.
queertheology.com through workshops, through blog posts, through courses. You and Brian G. Murphy, talk a little bit about that work, maybe even how it got started and kind of the reach of that. Yeah, it was one of the first, maybe even the first resource of its kind for
Yeah.
queer Christians. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we started that in 2013 because both of us had been experiencing conversations in LGBT Christian spaces that were really focused on, is it okay to be gay?
Hmm.
And that was where they ended, right? It was
Yeah.
it was the finish line for many of these organizations was to get people to saying yes, it's okay to be LGBT. And we just kept looking around and being like, well, there's so much more out there. Like once you get past that question, there's so much richness to be found in reading scripture from a queer and trans lens, in talking about what straight and cisgender folks can learn from LGBT Christians, right? There's so much richness, and we were also had been really inspired by academic queer theology, but that work was really inaccessible to folks that
Mm.
weren't in the academy, right? It's like, I mean, I love it, and also sometimes you got to read a paragraph like 4 times to be able to even like articulate what's happening. And both of us had grown up in evangelical communities where things were really accessible, right? Where graphics were really pretty, where videos were well done, and we just weren't seeing that in progressive spaces. So we kind of put our heads together of like, if we could create something for people that are where we are, what would that look like? And it
Mm.
would look like things that are really pretty, things that took the Bible really seriously, but also took justice really seriously.
Mm.
A work that took, yes, absolutely, it's okay to be LGBTQ plus and Christian as the starting point, not the finish line.
Mm.
And so we started with a course on how to read the Bible queerly that we did on Google Hangouts because Zoom didn't exist
Yeah.
then. And we started with the podcast. I think now we're the longest running LGBTQ plus Christian podcast. We've been going for since 2013,
Mm.
pretty much every single week. We
Mhm.
started before their podcasts were doing seasons, and I kind of wish we had waited a little longer because the weekly thing is exhausting. But it's been so great to do this work, and it's just expanded from there. And I think it's really helped to push the conversation um, toward asking like, what are the unique gifts that queer and trans folks have that the church is missing out on when it excludes us, or even when it includes us but doesn't let us lead, right?
Mm.
I think that there's just such richness,
Mm.
and we consider ourselves very much from a long line of other types of theology that come from the margins: liberation theology,
Yes.
black theology, womanist feminist theology. We're building on and learning from and incorporating and finding ourselves in that same kind of stream, and
Mm.
we think it's all really important to the current of the church, but also to the future of the church.
Mm. And I've noticed, just I haven't been a huge part of queertheology.com, but I did take one course a couple maybe a year ago, and I was able to be a part of some of the community, and there's just
Yeah,
a really rich, robust community of people who are a
yeah,
part of that world and who have taken those courses, and there's message boards and there's all kinds
yeah.
of really rich community I've noticed that you have been able to create and foster around queertheology.com. And I just really appreciated that. And I think it's really beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's been the gift for us, right? To
Mm.
be in community with so many people. There are people literally from all over the world
Hmm.
inside of Sanctuary Collective now, and
Yeah.
it's just so great to have those conversations, to know that any time of day or night, someone's awake and someone's
Yeah.
hanging out, and to learn from other people, right? To
Hmm.
learn how they're reading scripture, to learn what it's like in their context, in their church, in their country. It's just
Hmm.
been such a gift.
Hmm. One of the things that I think is fascinating about you is that you were the first openly transgender, well, maybe perhaps the first transgender man who is ordained in the Old Catholic Church. Can you talk a little bit about that? First, I think people will be curious to know what the Old Catholic Church is. And yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Old Catholic Church is an independent, progressive Catholic group. They're not in communion with Rome. They ordain women, LGBTQ folks, people who are married, partnered, divorced. They have a really rich history. This is not a new tradition. It started in the 1700s in the Netherlands. All sorts of like lovely, geeky church trivia and drama behind how they started. It came to the United States about 200 years ago, and I, you know, did not grow up Catholic. I had been really influenced by a lot of Catholic thinkers, particularly as I was starting to figure out what my faith looked like as a
Mm,
queer and trans person, as someone who was learning that the Bible cared a lot about justice in a way that
mm,
I didn't feel like I had been taught growing up. And so I've been deeply impacted by people like Dorothy Day and Philip and Daniel Berrigan, but never really thought that the church would have a place for me.
mm,
And the Old Catholic Church actually found me on Twitter, of all places. And they reached out and they were like, hey, we want to get the word out that we ordain trans folks. Can you help us? I was like, I have never heard of this community. So I got on the phone with one of the bishops and we started to have a conversation about, who they were and what they stood for. And I started to feel like, oh, I think that this is actually where I belong, that there's something in this tradition and this expression that is the right fit for me, and also a place where I can be of use in the world.
mm,
And so I was ordained in 2013 in Minneapolis, ordained as a deacon at the Philly Trans Health Conference. We did it as a
mm,
public witness
mhm,
in I believe 20 earlier in 2012, and then I was ordained as a priest in Minneapolis in 2013. And it's been such a gift to be a part of that community. They're really focused on new church starts, on meeting a lot of meeting recovering Roman Catholics who
mm,
have felt like the church didn't have a place for them
mhm.
because they were queer, because they were divorced, because any number of things.
Yeah.
And but that kind of mix of deep liturgical tradition and a real focus on social justice has both shaped me as a person, shapes my ministry, and so it's been a gift to be in that community.
Mm. And I heard you on another podcast. I can't remember what, but as I was doing homework this week, you said some trans women beat you into the
Yeah. Oh,
priesthood,
yes. Which I love.
but you were the first trans man. So,
First openly. There are
mm,
other folks that were ordained and then transitioned or came out after. And so it's important, and it's also important to name that, like,
mhm,
anytime that there's someone who's the first, there was probably someone before
mm,
them who didn't have the same luxury to be out
mm,
or to be public about their identity. And so
yeah,
I don't want to. I feel like I stand in such a lineage of
mm,
witnesses that I never want to be like, I never want to be pushing someone out of the way, right? Just
yeah, yeah.
for a title. But
I appreciate that. I came out of the closet later in life. I was 44 years old. It was 2016, and a lot of the work that I have done since then, I call Gay 101. I've been watching documentaries and reading history, and I am so aware that I stand on the shoulders of people who have gone
yeah,
before me. I am surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses
yeah,
who have gone, long before me. And I remember watching, I'm going to forget the name. It's a documentary on Netflix about trans people in entertainment. Uh,
disclosure.
yes, thank you, Disclosure. It was
Yeah,
just fascinating, and
yeah,
talking about the people who passed, even in the past, who were trans, but no one knew it, and
yeah,
that was really powerful to realize that, again, people are openly trans now, but there have been people in the past who were trans
yeah,
who just, didn't have the luxury of coming out.
yeah,
So thanks for
totally.
reminding us of that.
Yeah.
Again, another person jumping in, Neil Ellis Orts, saying howdy from Houston, watching on YouTube. So hello, Neil. Um, Talk to us about, another huge part of your life is theater,
Yeah.
and you are a playwright and actor, and you founded a theater company in Minneapolis called Uprising. And I would just love to I've heard you talk about it before. I listened to the Queerology podcast recently. That was a beautiful interview you gave with Matthias Roberts. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about maybe Uprising and kind of how that work has been so meaningful and important to you over the years?
Yeah, so Uprising started in 2015, and we started it because we wanted to do social justice theater. Our affectionate tagline was social justice theater that didn't suck, because growing up doing a lot of Christian drama that it was just bad, right? Like it was
Yeah.
just objectively bad art, because it was propaganda, and I think that much social justice theater has that same. Um, Feel, or people assume that it's going to be that. And so we were
Mm,
like, okay, well, how can we do theater about really important justice issues that actually invites people into a conversation that doesn't feel preachy or strident, but that inspires people to deeper empathy, to change their mind, maybe to get involved,
mm,
if it's something that they're already in support of. And I started it thinking that I needed slash wanted a place that was outside of religion to have conversations about justice, because I was seeing lots of conversations happening in religious spaces. And I was like, what might it look like? And I quickly realized that like the impulse behind theater is the same impulse behind church, right? That we're like getting in a room
mm,
together to tell stories, to make meaning, to change things. And so it became this like deeply spiritual experience, but also became a way to push me to think more deeply about how I was talking about justice issues, about how I was telling stories, about what are the ways that we invite people in so that their defenses are lowered so that they
mm.
can even engage with a story. And that kind of training in theater and in playwriting, I think has also now deeply impacted my theology and my church work.
Mm,
But it's been such a beautiful synergy, and it feels like it's all very much coming from the same kind of ancient impulse, right? To
mm.
tell stories, to make sense of ourselves. And I think that it's like so vital that we pay attention to what stories are being told, who's telling those stories.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up that Disclosure documentary. It's If folks haven't seen it, like it's one
Mm,
of the best to both talk about the history of how trans people have been portrayed in film, but also the power and the potential of what could be,
yeah.
if more trans people were in rooms. And I think that it's, obviously that's not just trans folks, right? That's anyone
Mhm.
on the margins
Yeah.
who needs to be given the agency to tell their own stories, and to tell stories about joy, not just trauma,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Like there's so much that I've been learning from being in theater that's been
Mm,
so impactful.
mhm. Yeah, thank you. Um, and I think from there, I wanna talk about how I kind of discovered you, I guess, on
Yeah,
this side of the closet door. I love this story, and it was really significant to me because and this is just like, disclosure, I guess, on my part. As I was coming out of the closet later in life, kind of doing this work, this endless agonizing work of like, is it okay to be gay and a Christian? I totally agree that is what most kind of Christian and queer websites and books tend to be about, right? Is this
yeah,
endless agonizing over and over again. Is it okay? Is it okay? Is it okay? And I was in the thick of that. And and I remember as I was doing that, um, the trans question for me was kind of even further out. I
yeah,
just didn't
yeah,
understand it, to be honest. Like, and it seemed like this really confusing and difficult barrier to me. I had gotten to this place where I was like, I think it's okay to be gay, but the trans thing seems very confusing, and I just didn't have language for it, and I didn't have any I didn't know what to think of it, to be honest. But I was out there on Twitter, and I was starting to follow different people, and I started to follow you on Twitter, and you were one of the first trans people who I was really listening to, and I was reading things that you were writing, and I was really, I don't know, I was just really impressed by you and learning from you. Um, and you struck me as just this very confident, very knowledgeable, and I trusted you. I don't know why, but something about the way that you came across and your knowledge and I trusted you, and I was following you and interacting with you. And at some point in that relationship, you direct messaged me, I think, if my memory serves me right. And you said, "Do you remember me? Do you remember me from Grace?" And it just blew my mind. And I was like, "What? What? Remember you from Grace?" And somehow it kind of all came flooding back. Shannon Kearns from Grace College.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you kind of described yourself or what, but I remembered you then pre-transition from Grace College, and the memory of you that I had was kind of this awkward, shy, maybe uncomfortable in her skin kind of person, baseball cap backwards, and it just, I don't know, there was something in that moment of going like, oh my gosh, this like confident man that I've been interacting with on the interwebs is
Yeah.
who he is who he always has been. And it just was like maybe that last domino that needed to fall for me. You were that person that helped me go, I don't know, this just makes sense to me. Like, of course you're a man. And there was just this moment of recognition in my spirit that just went, thank you. I needed that domino to fall, and God used you and that memory of who you were to enlighten me somehow, and I'm just grateful for that connection that helped me to see like that person that I remembered. I don't know, like this is the real you,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
always has been. It always
Yeah.
has been. So I love that connection point. I'm so glad that you reminded me of the fact that I did know you back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah. I'm glad I can. I'm glad it's not like triggering
Yeah.
or
No. No.
problematic at all to remind
No.
you of your past self.
No, and I will say I'm a trans person who has really grappled with my past and
Mhm.
who has a lot of peace with it, right? I don't I'm someone who like doesn't mind seeing old photos. I mean,
Mhm.
other than the fact that like the 90s were awkward, but like that
Mhm.
that is a different issue than trans stuff. But it's like I think for me it's important to be able to talk about and to reckon with both photos and stories and videos, both because they were such a huge part of my life, but also because I think, like you said, if I look at them, I'm like, oh, this has always been there.
Yeah.
I just didn't have language
Mhm.
or even permission to talk about these things, and so it's so important now that I go back and I grapple with and I share some of these things in the hopes that it gives someone else language and permission and and a sense of hope, right? A hope that
Mm.
they can grow up into who
Yeah.
they already know they are. Right?
Yeah. And I appreciate, like, if anyone wants to follow you on Instagram, Shannon T.L. Kearns on Instagram, you share old photos,
Yeah,
old
yeah,
videos of you from the 90s, rapping or whatever, dressed in your, doing your Operation Barnabas skits, and it's
yeah,
great. I always appreciate that. It's like these old photos of you in your pre-transition life, and it's like, wow, this is bold of you, but
mhm,
I really appreciate it because it shows this evolution. It shows such a
yeah,
dramatic change in your life.
yeah.
Yeah. That brings me to a question I've been curious about, and you mentioned it a little bit in your book, but you didn't change your name,
Mm-mm.
and I'm curious about that. Like, was that an intentional choice on your part? I suppose, of course, it was, but what was the thinking behind that? Do you mind talking about that?
No, I don't mind at all. I always liked my name.
Mm,
I never felt it was never my name that felt uncomfortable to
mm,
me. It always felt like mine, and so
mhm.
when and I I like knew lots of guy Shannons. I
Yeah.
think that that is less popular now, maybe, but it never felt like the thing that was chafing, right? And
Mm,
so when it
mhm.
came time to decide if I was going to change my name, I was like, no, I don't think I want to. Like this is mine. I did add a middle name because both my first and middle name are very gender neutral and
Mm.
spelled gender neutral, which I find hysterical coming from the culture in which we did that.
Yeah.
Somehow I ended up with like both a first and middle name that didn't need to change, no spelling, no nothing. Um, and my mom's name is very similar to my first name, and so I wanted to take a middle name that was both decidedly masculine, but also then connected me to my dad, and so I took his first name as one of my middle names and kept my
Mm.
second middle name.
Okay.
And so that's why I have the TL. I added a middle name, but yeah, I I feel really lucky that I didn't have to change my name. Not that I think that would have been complicated, but I feel grateful that it has always felt like mine, and
Mm,
it feels like this beautiful piece of continuity for
mhm,
me of
mhm.
that I can hold on to this, and feel connected to all parts of
Mm,
my life and my journey,
yeah.
and it feels like a gift. It feels like a grace, right?
Mhm.
To have had that.
That's interesting. I relate to that in some ways. I know that a lot of people like me who come out later in life. I have known so many guys who, especially those who were married and have children and all this, they kind of like scrub their social media and like it's just done. They delete it and start over. And I just have never wanted to do that. My life is my life. It is what it
Yeah,
is. My whole life is what it is. You scroll back far enough and you've got married me with the children and the whole life. My life is what it is. And I don't want to hide or pretend like any of it didn't happen. And
yeah,
for whatever reason, and I don't judge anyone for doing their life the way they
for
do
sure.
their
Yeah,
life, but
yeah,
but to me, just like you said, it feels like grace to just accept that this is my life and that was my life and it's all part of the same unfolding story, the same grace-filled journey, and I'm really thankful for that. Like I don't have to
yeah.
hide any part of it. It just is what it is. Yeah, I'm really
Yeah,
thankful
and I
for
feel
that.
like so much of my own, like, internal work has been about integration,
Mm,
right? And that, like, for me, uh, part of coming home to my body by transitioning has also been, how do I integrate all of the parts that I've been? How do I also own up to moments of shame or embarrassment, or
mm,
the nutty things I did when I was on summer mission trips that now I look back on, I'm like, oh my lord, like what what was happening? But it's been an important thing for me to face that and to work to integrate that, so that there's no part of me that feels cut off or divorced, or that isn't a part of the whole. And I think that comes from feeling so long divorced from my body, that it was
mm,
vital to me that, like, once I came home to my body, it was like, no, it's all got to be in there. We gotta
mm,
the whole of it has to be grappled with,
mhm.
um, which doesn't mean that that's not an ongoing process, or that there are stories that I'm not ready to tell yet, right? Like,
Right.
but that integration process is so important to me.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. A couple questions quick. Brian Doe, Matt, will this be recorded so that we may share it with friends? Yes, absolutely. Thank you both for being here. Happy to do it. And it'll live forever on YouTube and Facebook Live. And Carrie says, hello from Cherville, Indiana. Carrie, welcome. Glad you're here.
Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to drop in comments and questions, and we'll do our best to get to them. Um, yeah, so going back to the fact that I mean, vaguely knew of each other at least.
Yeah.
So Shannon and I both grew up in what was then called the Grace Brethren Fellowship of Churches. It's now called, I believe, the Charis Fellowship. They changed their name several years ago now. Um, but yeah, and then we both went on a summer missions trip called Operation Barnabas, and they shortened it amazingly to OB, which I believe is a women's hygiene product, but
It is
it is.
endlessly entertaining to me.
Yes, it is. I was on OB 90. When were you on it?
98 was
98.
my
So yeah,
right before I started at Grace.
right before. Okay, so I did the
Yeah,
same right after my senior year of high school.
yeah,
And then, yeah, and then we both went to Grace College, which is the one and only Grace Brethren School
yeah,
college. Yeah. And I graduated from Grace in 1995, but then I stayed on at Grace and worked in the admissions department. I directed a touring music group called Sound Investment, which I had idolized as a teenager and wanted desperately to be in. And so when I actually got to be in it and then got to direct it and got to travel and tour, and I like sang in the group and toured it around Pennsylvania. And Shannon and I were talking before we toured at Camp Conquest, where Shannon was actually a camper, I think, and maybe even a counselor. Were you on staff there ever?
at some point, yeah, at
Okay.
some point I transitioned over into staff. I don't know
Okay.
when that happened, but
So we probably were there at the same time at some
yeah,
point. But
for
but
sure.
yeah, our paths crossed quite a bit, kind of in those years in the '90s,
Yeah,
and Yeah, kind of cool. And I believe you at some point auditioned for me for Sound Investment at one
I
point.
think so, yeah. It was a very bad audition. But I too had been someone who, like, idolized Sound Investment. I was like, "I'm gonna" I remember I was like, "I was gonna go to Grace, and I was gonna get into Sound Investment, I was gonna get into Remnant, the traveling drama team, and I was
Yes.
gonna, like, be in all of the plays." And then I got there my freshman year and got rejected from all of them. It
You-
was like, "Oh, okay. Well, I guess something else is gonna have to happen."
I think if I remember correctly, I think you rapped in your audition for Sound Investment. I think.
I might have. That does
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like me.
Yeah. But I'm surprised you didn't get in Remnant. I had forgotten all about Remnant until this moment.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that,
I
yeah,
finally got in my senior year, but that yeah, but it was my freshman year dreams were dashed.
yeah. But I love, as I was reading your book, I just love that at Grace College, this, really truly fundamentalist, extremely conservative school, I was deeply closeted when I was there. I mean, I didn't let anybody know I was gay. I knew I was gay, but I was just deeply closeted and hiding desperately the whole time. But I love that you found theater and that you ended up writing plays which were massive hits basically. I mean, all these people came and you wrote about
Yeah.
real life. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think, my experience at Grace was complicated,
Mhm.
right? I was starting to really get a sense of who I was
Mhm.
as a queer person. I still didn't have any language, around gender. I
Right.
mean, I knew that, like, I didn't fit in gender-wise, but, like, I mean, this is 1998 to 2002, so, like, the conversation about trans issues in the world is not really happening.
Right.
It's definitely not happening in evangelical circles. Um, I don't even remember that many conversations about homosexuality or
Mm-mm.
being gay, at this point. It was, like, assumed that you wouldn't be that, but, like, we didn't really talk about it. And so here I am, this young person who, I've looked like a 13-year-old boy since I was, like, 12, and so I'm dressing in baggy clothes, I've got short hair, and yet I'm living in the girls' dorm, and it's, like, super awkward, and no one quite knows what to do with
Mm.
me, which is also why, like, I couldn't get parts in any of the school plays because
Right.
they're doing 1940s murder mysteries, and here I walk in, and they're like, "Well, we can't put you in this play, like, we don't know what to do with you." Um, and so I ended up taking a class, I think this was sophomore or junior year, called Religious Drama Workshop, which was all about, like, writing Christian dramas, basically. And for my final project, I wrote a one act and it went over okay in class. And so I asked permission, like, can I do this as a student led production? Will you let me finish it into a full length and produce it? And Grace, to their credit, said, "Yeah, go for it and we'll pay for it." Like, so they paid for that production. They didn't ask me what it was going to be about. They didn't ask to read the script. No one censored it. Um, and we did this play, and it was a play that grappled with things like mental health and teen pregnancy and eating disorders and parental abuse and all of these things that no one was talking about, but that was clearly happening in
Mm.
our community. And I think that's why it struck such a chord, not
Mhm.
because it was well done or a deft handling of any of these topics, but because people were so hungry to have real conversations
Mm.
about anything. And it was like, no one is talking about these things. And so I did that play and then was given permission to do another one, and so then wrote a show called Masquerade, which was pretty much a direct kind of allegory affront to what felt like the really stifling grace culture and the
Mm.
grace brethren culture and the church culture. And it was all about the masks that we felt we had to wear. So it's this play that uses dance, which was also against the rules at Grace, to tell the story. So it's a musical, except instead of singing, people dance. And it's a group of dancers who come together every week to do these assigned steps. And they all wear masks. And then at some point, they start to take off their masks and speak to the audience and tell the truth. And by the end of the show, everyone has taken their masks off and is telling the truth. And a character came out in that show. And I remember like I had to say at the end, like, I'm not gonna act on it, right? Like that was the way that you could like get around like having a gay character. But even then I was really trying to push the conversation. I thought that I was gonna get kicked out. A friend and I who were co-directing it, we had so many conversations about
Mm,
like this could be it for us. Like we're going to do this show, and if this is the reason, like that's going to be fine. And there was a professor who was the head of the communications department who really stood up for us, and I think in ways that I probably still don't know protected me from a
mm,
lot of blowback.
mhm,
He had told me some stories of complaints he got. My guess is that there was a lot more that he really shielded me from, and I give a lot of credit to his courage in that space to realize that there was a student who was trying to work some things out, but also was
mm.
trying to start some conversations. And
Yeah.
he really created the space to let that happen.
That I mean, that's beautiful. That story right there is, like, worth the whole interview to me because it's just, like, it's so hopeful and encouraging to me to think, like, how many years ago that was happening, and
Yeah.
that's incredible. I love that you did that. You did that. You wrote, like, this incredibly provocative, real play, and then they let you do another one. That's
I know,
incredible.
right?
Incredible. And I
Yeah,
love
and I
that,
think that that all comes from like it has always been this impulse in me. I think to push the boundaries, but not as a as a kid. I think it was perceived as I was trying to just like be a problem,
yeah.
and I think I probably carried some of that attitude as a young person. But looking back, it's very clear to me that the impulse behind it was people are dying because we're not talking about things. So
Yeah.
someone's got to talk about them, and if no one's going to do it, then then I guess it's going to be me.
Mm,
And I just remember even as a 15, 16 year old feeling like I know things are happening
mm,
that are causing deep distress. Why are we not talking? Like,
mm,
if our churches are supposed to be havens, if our churches are supposed to be welcoming of all people, if this is supposed to be the place where people come for hope, we have to be able to grapple with this.
yeah.
And if we don't, like, we're the cause of people's suffering,
Mm,
continued suffering. And so I just felt this responsibility that has continued in my life
yeah.
to be the one who's like, well, we're going to talk about these things, and we
Mhm.
have to talk about these things.
Yeah. Incredible. Um, before we wrap up, I want to definitely talk about the book a little bit this way.
Yeah.
um, and it's equal parts memoir and theology and
Yeah.
talking about the Bible. And I loved that about it. And it's, like we've said, it's not at all like, can I be trans or gay and a Christian? I mean, uh, the answer is yes, and you kind of start there. But I love that it's not that at all. There's other books, and you list them in the back. Like if you want to talk about that, look at Austin Hartke's book. Look at this
Yeah.
book, and that's all well and good. People definitely need that, but this is not your book. But I love that it's like theological reflections. It's looking at the Bible and it's kind of queering the Bible. Um, can you talk a little bit about that for people? One of the things I think that maybe straight and cisgender people don't understand often is how queer and trans people can enrich their understandings of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Queer theology, trans theology is not just for queer and trans people, it's
Yes.
for everybody. In fact,
Yeah.
they are richer for the work that you have done. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that in general?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for asking that, because I think that that's so important to this book, to all of our work, to all of queer and trans theologians' work, right? There's this idea that queer and trans theology is just for queer and trans people, or if it is for straight and cisgender people, it's so that like they can understand the struggles of being
Mm,
queer and trans better. But it's not about how it's going to actually impact their lives
right.
or change their lives. And so I think the first thing, there are like two important things to name for me. One is that part of doing queer and trans theology is simply to just name the context that I'm doing theology from.
Mm,
I'm a white transgender man in the United States. Of course, when I read scripture, I'm going to read from that perspective. this idea that there is, somehow a completely objective place from which anyone reads scripture is just not true.
Right. Right.
Right? What it is that we've coded that white, cisgender, straight men from Europe and the Americas, are the ones that have like objective theology, and
Hmm.
everyone else is identity politics. And it's like,
Right.
no, they're also reading from a particular context.
Yeah.
They're just not naming it. And so the first thing is like what queer and trans theologians are doing, or we're naming our particular context. And in that naming, hopefully, it also becomes a reflection on the reader to name their own context
Yeah.
and the place that they're approaching theology from. So that's like the first thing to name. And then the second thing is that, people who are reading from the margins, and in my case, from the perspective of a trans person, when I'm reading scripture, there are certain things that are going to pop differently for me because of that context, right? I'm going to pay attention in a different way to stories about bodies. I'm
Mm.
going to pay attention in a different way to stories where people are clearly violating gender norms, like from now, but also from the time that they were living in. I'm going to pay attention to stories that talk about scars, right? Because I have an intimate knowledge of scars. I'm going to pay attention to stories that talk about liminal spaces or borders or boundaries. And in doing that and talking about those things, I'm inviting other people to think about their body
Mm.
and their scars and their boundaries and borders. And it's a way of calling attention to these things and inviting people into a deeper and richer reflection that is expanded upon by people from all of these particular contexts coming together to have these conversations. And so, like, what I hope, I hope the book increases empathy for trans folks. Of course,
Of course.
all of my work is about that. And also, I really hope that folks read this book and are like, oh, I, I actually need to do some thinking about how I relate to my body, and what I've been taught about purity, or what I've been taught about the divide between head and heart, or how I've internalized these messages that, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak,
Mm.
right? And I think that, like,
Yes.
because I'm reading so explicitly from a trans perspective about bodies and flesh, and how those messages got mixed up in me, I think it points a light to those things, and asks other people to do that same reflection.
Hmm. Yeah. I can't remember exactly the chapter it was in, but you're talking about um, maybe it's about respectability politics,
Yeah,
and kind of, or maybe it's about sexual outsiders, and how kind of like as these things fall, as we kind of step outside these particular boundaries, then oh my gosh, everything else starts to be questioned, right? Then we
yeah,
can question um, um, capitalism, but then we can question all these other boundaries and borders that the world tries to put on us, right?
yep,
And wouldn't that be a good thing for us to start thinking about all these other um, I don't know, barriers and borders that
yeah,
the world tries to tell us are expectations, right? And maybe we can kind of lead the way in with our queer selves in kind of questioning everything, right? If we're questioning our relationships, if we're
yeah,
questioning our sexuality, then we can also question these other systems that have been laid on top of us, and maybe we can lead the way in that.
yeah. And I think that, I think in the culture that we grew up in, they would have never said this, but it was very clear that, like, sexual sin was the worst,
Of
right? That
course,
there
yeah,
was this thing, there was this fundamental, like, angst around bodies and sexuality and
yeah,
sex in particular.
hmm,
And I think that what you just said is so vital, because it's not about purity or sexuality. It's about power,
mm,
right?
yeah,
And it's about power in all of these structures. So when we're talking about capitalism, when we're talking about boundaries and borders, when we're talking about outsiders, right? All we're talking about is power. And of course, people want to pull that in because it allows power to be concentrated.
mm,
And when you pull it apart instead, that gets really scary for people. And it's why people are like, well, if we just let gay people get married, well, anything goes. And it's like, no, it's still about consent and respect and adults, right?
Hmm.
But it's like because it threatens that kind of grasp of power.
Yeah.
And I think that like that's why queer and trans people have so much to offer, because we are questioning those systems. And
Hmm.
we're not only saying like let's let it all fall. We're
Right.
saying what are we going to build around, in the midst, in spite of, that is actually consensual, that is based on mutual accountability and mutual relationship, that's not based on power and
Yes.
control.
Yes.
And that's, I think that's really scary for folks, but it's
Hmm.
also like the way to liberation.
Yeah. Again, I should have marked all these down so I could read passages to you and ask you to comment on them. There was a passage where you're talking about really getting in touch with your body and knowing deeply what you needed to do and
Yeah,
trusting yourself. I loved that passage. It was so beautiful, and it was impactful to me because it's like learning to trust and listen to your body. And trans
yeah,
people really can lead the way there because, as the rest of the world tells you, no, don't do that, you're saying, no, I know what I need to do. I know I
yeah,
need this gender affirming surgery. I know I need this medical transition. I know I need this. And it's about getting in touch, listening to the still small voice within, trusting God, and leading the way, right?
yeah.
Uh, do you know which passage I'm referring to? And can you talk about that? Because I thought
Yeah,
that was so
yeah.
profound, and it has to do, and I think you can teach us who are cisgender about listening to God, about listening to our own bodies, and really trusting ourselves, trusting our hearts. We've been told not to do that, but
Yeah.
learning to listen to our bodies, that's important.
And I think that like that piece of, we've been taught not to trust our hearts and we've
Hmm.
been taught not to trust our bodies, like that kind of co-teaching, I think, is what kept me from realizing I was trans for so much longer,
Yeah.
right? Because I I would have that still small voice and I would be like, "No, that's sin." Right?
Right.
That's,
Right.
I'm being led astray. I
Yeah.
can't trust my intuition. Um I I can't trust my body. I can't get in touch with desire.
Yes.
And it wasn't just like sexual desire. It was like I can't get in touch with any desire. I
Mm,
can't want anything.
mm,
Right? I'm working on this solo piece that's about my life as a performer and also transition. And I am talking about this, and you were probably taught this too, the acronym JOY,
oh yeah,
Jesus,
Jesus,
others,
others,
you.
you. Yep.
Right? And it's this idea that like you don't really matter. Your needs and desires don't matter. And so my whole life had been pushing down any thought of myself
Hmm.
and then calling that holy, right?
Right.
I'm super pure because I don't want anything, and that's holy. And
Mm,
when really it's like, no, you're just completely disconnected from
yeah.
yourself and from everything.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I transitioned, because I transitioning to me felt like one of the first, like, it wasn't selfish, but it felt like one of the first times in my life that I put myself first and I said,
Mm,
no matter what it costs me, I'm going to do this. And part of that was because if I don't, I'm going to die, right?
mm,
There,
mhm.
it was a very clear line for me of
Yeah.
I will be miserable forever and maybe
Mm,
not survive, or
yeah.
I'm going to do this and it might cost me everything.
Yeah.
And so like I transitioned, and in that act started to come back to my body, and that side effect was, it also was a moment of coming back to intuition, of learning to trust all of these systems that I had been taught to ignore, and to say like, oh, you know what, I am nauseous every morning, maybe this is not a good work situation for me,
Mm,
and maybe I need to listen to my, like maybe this isn't my body leading me astray, maybe instead it's leading me home.
yeah.
And all of that work then I think also caused me to like be able to fuse and marry my intellect and my heart again, to where my faith wasn't just study of political structures and exegesis and hermeneutic, like all of those
Hmm.
big
Hmm.
fancy words. It was like Oh, it's grounded in all of that, and also it's deeply
Mm,
heart-centered and connected again.
yeah.
And it's holistic, and now I understand that, like, our bodies and our intuition are not the enemy, they're
Mm,
the gift. Like,
yeah.
God has put in us these systems to pay attention to because they
Mm,
are leading us towards wholeness and life and abundance
yeah.
and towards spirit, right? They're leading us to connection always. It's always about leading us to connection.
Mm,
And it's about warning us when we're in places where connection isn't possible or where fracture is happening and where we might need to be the namers of that or where we might need to flee from those spaces.
mm, yeah.
Um, but I think that, like, because I had such a very specific and very embodied experience of the act of transitioning, it has helped me to name things that I think are happening for all of us, and
Mhm.
especially are happening for many of us who grew up in these kind of evangelical cultures.
Yeah.
That I'm able to name them in a way that I think gives language to other people who are also feeling that sense of, like, I don't know, I feel disconnected.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and so it's like, so part of my work is to say, like, no, like, you can trust yourself.
Mhm.
There is something in you that you can trust,
Yeah,
and you just have
yeah.
to learn how to listen to that again.
Mhm. It reminds me, and this is a little, different, but one of your, one of your common tweets is to say, "Checking in.
Yeah,
Have you had some water? Have you rested enough? Have you taken your medication?" It's like, listen to your body. What do you need? Are you caring for yourself? Are you making sure that you are well fed and taken care of? And I love that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who have grown up without that practice, we
Mhm.
sometimes need those reminders. We need
Yeah.
someone to say, like, "Have you checked in with yourself? What is
Yeah.
happening in you?" Um, Rob Bell will often ask people, like, "Okay, take a deep breath,
Mm.
sink into your heart." And he's like, "Every time when I do that with someone, they immediately know the answer to the question that they've been spinning over for hours,
Mm.
because it's always been there, but
Mm.
they've just been not able to listen to it, and that
Mhm.
that invitation to, like, take a deep breath. What does your heart say? They're
Yeah.
like, oh, I know. It's like, yeah,
Mhm.
you do.
Mm.
Great, now go do it, or, like, figure out what the next steps are in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just mention one final passage that I thought was really particularly poignant and beautiful in your book was in the chapter on resurrection, because I think Christianity has always been at its heart a resurrection story. It's a
Yeah,
story of life from death. It's a story of beauty from ashes. It's a story of rebirth. And you tell this just poignant, beautiful story about, um, and I couldn't believe this. There were only 3 surgeons doing chest surgeries at the time in whatever 2007. I couldn't believe
yeah,
that. Only 3 surgeons in the United States, and how trans people would kind of uh, help others to see what it was going to be like, and you could
yeah,
like reveal your scars to each other and say, look, this is what it looks like, this is how you're going to care for yourself, this is what to avoid, this is how, what to look out for, this is what you're looking for. I just thought that was such a beautiful picture of, I don't know, community
yeah,
care for each other. I don't know, just a lovely a story of people caring for each other, showing the way to resurrection. Like, look, it's possible, and it will get
yeah.
better, and it's going to be beautiful, and you're going to be reborn. And look at this. I don't know. Do you have anything to say about that story?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's just so striking to me, right? That I started my transition in 2008. Things have changed so much. Like you
Hmm.
said, there were 3 surgeons in the United States. We all knew their names. They would there's this, musician named Coyote Joe, or Coyote Grace. Joe Stevens is one of the musicians, and, like, he shouts out the name of his surgeon in one of the songs, and, like, a whole bunch of people cheer, right? Because it was, like, one of the 3, and so you became in these camps of, like, "Oh, I went to this guy, I went to this
Wow.
guy." But it was wild, right? You had to pay out of cash. I, like, withdrew, like, $8,000 and handed them a stack of cash. I had to travel to Ohio. I had surgery in the morning and then was discharged to a hotel the same day
Wow.
and, like, had to stay in that hotel for a week. But there was this culture on LiveJournal and at the Philly Trans Health Conference where we became our own advisors because no
Mm,
one was doing that for us. Often you wouldn't meet your surgeon until the day of your surgery because you couldn't get to them. And so
mm,
when you're doing a consult over the phone, you're sending photographs through email and you like maybe have seen someone's results. And so the Philly Trans Health Conference did this thing called a chest surgery show and tell, which they got everyone in this giant like ballroom, and people who were willing would go under the sign of one of their surgeons, right? Like one of the three surgeons. And at the time, they would take off their shirts and they
mm,
would let people walk around and ask questions. And I know even for other types of surgery, people were willing to literally get naked for other people so
mm.
that they could have information to make informed decisions.
Wow.
And people are sharing information about like this is the post care routine that I followed that helped me reduce the scarring, and this is what I wish I would have known, right? And it was
Mm,
this whole community of people who had to look out for one another because no one was doing that work for us. And also, in the midst of that, we became a community of care to say, like, we can take care of each other. Like, if you're not going to do this work, we're going to do it for each other because we
mhm.
matter, and we're going to care for one another. And I think it's like such a vital example of what can be
Mm,
when people are willing to show up for one another.
mhm.
And again, it's this moment of a marginalized community being able to say, this is an example of the way forward. This is
Yeah.
what we can be. This is available to all of us. So
Mhm.
let's find out ways to put it into place.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful. Uh, well, this has just been a lovely conversation. I'm so grateful for your time, grateful for all of the incredible work you've done for so many years, and for the path that you've walked, and for the example that you've been, and for the light that you are to so many people.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So thank you. How can people find the book? Where can people find you online? How can people follow you and support you?
Yeah, the book, you can get it anywhere books are sold. Of course, I am always in support of supporting independent bookstores, but if you got to use the big box ones, do that too. You can get it anywhere. I am at Shannon T.L. Kearns on all of the social media. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. And my website is shannontlkearns.com. And then obviously, we're also at queertheology.com. And Queer Theology is Q Theology on Twitter and Queer Theology everywhere else.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This interview will live forever on YouTube and Facebook Live. And yeah, go follow Shannon on all the socials. And again, thanks so much for this, Shannon. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
you. And we'll see you later. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Bye.